From the Chesapeake Bay Journal, your source for independent environmental reporting, this is Chesapeake Uncharted, the podcast that uncovers stories about the bay, its interconnected ecosystem, and the people who rely on them. I'm Jeremy Cox. On today's episode,
under the circumstances that the rain is continuing to fall and we're having the very rapid rise of almost a foot an hour or better in the river, it's my best estimate that Milton may see the worst flood that it has ever experienced.
It was the morning of Thursday, June 22nd, 1972. Vic Michael feared the worst. He was the station owner and manager of WMLP, a radio station based in Milton, Pennsylvania. He was also an amateur hydrologist, and he was more right than anyone could have imagined.
Therefore, the idea of a crest occurring this evening at 6 o'clock seems almost impossible to me at this moment. I do not personally see a crest on the river until perhaps as much as 18 to 24 hours after the rain stops.
The National Weather Service was predicting that the Susquehanna River was going to reach a flood level of 26 feet at 6 o'clock that evening, before going back down. Michael disagreed. In a voice tinged with rising alarm, he told his listeners that the river was destined to continue rising for several more hours, well into Friday. In fact, the river will likely approach, if not surpass, record flood levels. Hours went by. On that Thursday evening, with rain still falling in relentless sheets, Vic Michael was now all but certain that the record was going to be broken and a disaster was at hand.
So that means that Milton will definitely be going over 30 feet with almost certainty now.
Over the next few harrowing days, Michael's calculations proved to be almost spot on. The Susquehanna River, the lifeblood of Milton's economy and culture, crested at 34 feet, 17 feet above the flood stage. The nearly 10-foot difference between the official crest prediction and the actual crest was critical. Critical because each additional foot of flooding multiplied the financial damage and human suffering of a storm. How was Vic Michael able to beat the government's forecasters at their own game? He knew that the Susquehanna watershed was almost uniquely designed to flood, and why. Then he did the best he could to spread the message. In these archival recordings, you can hear Michael grapple in real time with the enormity of the disaster.
The late reports that I have here now is that all of the towns along the river are virtually isolated now, and things are becoming more serious by the minute. I hope that everyone will take this to heart and take whatever precautions are necessary so that we can avoid as much loss of life as possible.
This was like no other storm that central Pennsylvania had ever seen. No other storm that the Chesapeake Bay watershed had ever seen. And no other storm that the United States had ever seen. Tropical Storm Agnes was the storm that shocked America. On this, our second season of Chesapeake Uncharted, we're taking stock of Agnes. This year marks the storm's 50th anniversary. That's reason enough to look back. But as I quickly learned in my reporting of this story, the effects of Agnes are still with us. With each episode, I'll show you how, 50 years after its winds died down and the floodwaters receded, we're still living in the world Agnes created. People still live with the emotional scars. Communities, from Virginia up to New York, still bear physical scars. And the Chesapeake Bay still bears environmental scars. We'll talk about why this still matters today and for our future. On this episode, we revisit the storm itself. Agnes was the worst natural disaster in America up to that point and would remain atop that pedestal for another 20 years before Hurricane Andrew finally blew it off. The storm carved a path of destruction from the Florida Panhandle to New England leaving 122 people dead and causing $22 billion in damage in today's dollars. Agnes struck Florida as a hurricane. It might have receded into history, but it gained a second life. As it swirled toward the mid-Atlantic, Agnes merged with a low-pressure system, much the way Superstorm Sandy would 40 years later. Central Pennsylvania, as far from the tropics as just about anywhere, would nonetheless bear the brunt of this tropical storm. We'll talk about what happened next, after this short break. Chesapeake Uncharted is brought to you in part by Greenfin Studio, a marketing and communication firm focused on coastal, environmental, and social projects. They have helped hundreds of organizations engage new audiences and reach environmental goals. If your organization wants fresh ideas to expand your reach and deliver more effective messages, check them out at greenfinstudio.com. Welcome back. On today's episode of Chesapeake Uncharted, we're examining how Tropical Storm Agnes was able to devastate central Pennsylvania. This will be different from most stories that you hear about hurricanes or tropical storms. I know because I've been telling these stories for years. As a reporter in Florida in the 2000s, I covered several hurricanes, and I can tell you there are three main threats you have to worry about. The first two by far get the most media attention: wind and storm surge. This makes sense because both lead to catastrophic losses of property and life. And visually, they make for gripping videos and photographs. Our third threat, rain, is less dramatic, less flashy. In that respect, though, it can be even more harmful than wind and storm surge, because its consequences, they kind of sneak up on you. How was Vic Michael able to predict the extent of the flooding so accurately? To answer that, let's examine the nature of the storm itself. With Agnes, there was no storm surge. This happened in central Pennsylvania, miles from any coastline, and its winds were only maybe 45 miles per hour. Its primary weapon was rain, and lots of it.
Agnes brought more rain than any other single event up to its time in American history. It was calculated to be about 28 trillion gallons of water because it was so much rain over such a widespread area.
This is Gary Letcher, who was a University of Maryland student studying geology at the time of Agnes. He practiced environmental law in the D.C. area for years, and now, in retirement, has written a book about Agnes called Bold Forecast. He can recite the minutest of details about the storm as if he was telling you what he had for breakfast that morning.
In terms of inches of rain, widespread areas of a foot or more of rain. Most of eastern Pennsylvania, Maryland, had up to 15 inches. In the Westminster area, Hagerstown area, Virginia had up to 12 inches. North Carolina, more than 10 inches. The maximum was 18.2 inches at the Mahatango Research Station in the mountains just to the east of Harrisburg.
All that rain has to go somewhere. A watershed is like a funnel. At its top, the widest part, you have countless ditches and streams. As you move lower, farther downstream, those smaller water bodies empty into creeks or rivers, which are fewer in number. This entire area being drained spreads across 28,000 square miles, an area a little larger than the state of West Virginia. And when you finally get to the bottom of the funnel, all those waterways only have one place left to go: the Susquehanna River. What happened during Agnes is the same as what happens when you pour water into a funnel faster than it can escape out the bottom. It overflows. Or maybe you would prefer Letcher's comparison.
A slug of water is the exact way to put it. I call it a surge with a slug of water. It's like a rat going through a snake almost.
We're going to be focusing on central Pennsylvania here for this episode because it was the epicenter of the worst flooding. But let's not forget the larger context. Agnes was a big storm, geographically speaking, and that fact hampered the recovery and forced the nation to rethink the way it responded to weather disasters, according to Andrew Stoll. He's an environmental studies professor at Bucknell University in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, who has extensively studied Agnes's impacts.
So what made Agnes so bad? It wasn't a very windy hurricane or tropical system. It was a very wet one. And the path that it took, impacted a huge swath of the mid-Atlantic.
If you trace Agnes back to its formation, maybe the last thing that springs to mind is this is going to be a disaster for the mid-Atlantic. The storm stirred to life off the Yucatan Peninsula, nearly 3,000 miles away from Pennsylvania. Over the next few days, the storm intensified. It headed north up the western Caribbean Sea and the eastern Gulf of Mexico. Then it took aim at the Florida Panhandle. Here, I think it's important to note that June is not a historically active month for hurricanes in the Atlantic Basin. Since record-keeping began in the 1850s, just 5% of all tropical storms have occurred in June. Agnes was typical of these storms. Most get their start that time of year in the Caribbean or the Gulf. Agnes made landfall on June 19th near Panama City, Florida, as a minimal hurricane with winds of 75 miles per hour. It tracked across the southeast. Then, just below the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, Agnes went out to sea. What happened next, Letcher told me, took meteorologists by surprise.
It came back up along Delmarva, and then it got pulled directly west, this core of it right over Manhattan, and over Pennsylvania, westward over Pennsylvania. And the Weather Service was surprised.
What happened, Stoll said, was that just as Agnes was heading out to sea, it joined forces with a weather system in its path and quickly re-strengthened.
And then it hooks back, it turns back. So that was one unexpected course of events, which does happen with tropical systems. Mm-hmm. But, after it left North Carolina, people thought that's the end of this story. That's the end of this storm. We'll move on to the next letter, name the next one. But it turned back, and then it met a cold front, which was coming from the Midwest. And it met Agnes just over northern Pennsylvania, the southern tier of New York. And that cold front, meteorologists tell me, it slows down tropical systems. It forces them to stall and sit in place, and actually also to dump out all their water. And so because of that other system combined with Agnes and the particular location where it stalled, that's the reason why north central Pennsylvania had so much rain from this event, between 10 and 19 inches of rain in 2 days.
For that part of Pennsylvania, that's half a year's worth of rain delivered in just 2 days.
And that was on top of an already super wet spring.
We're all familiar with the expression, when it rains, it pours. Well, by June of that year, Pennsylvania already had seen plenty of rain, up to 4 inches in some areas during May alone, and now it was pouring. Milton, home to WMLP, was right in the middle of it. The town lies on the east side of the West Branch of the Susquehanna River, about 150 miles northwest of Philadelphia. In 1972, Milton had a population of about 7,700 residents. The community had been a manufacturing hub, home to steel mills and a big railroad car maker. It also was the site of the first Chef Boyardee canning plant. Vic Michael, interviewed 6 months after Agnes by one of his staff members for a radio documentary, recalled having a sick feeling as the storm approached on Wednesday, June 21st.
I'll tell you the truth, I really had a feeling of apprehension about the situation. As the night progressed and the intensity of the rain outside my home increased to almost cloudburst proportions, I really began to sense that a disaster was in the making.
These interviews and archival recordings come from that WMLP documentary. It's called The Agony of Agnes, and without it, these original tapes from the time of the storm likely would have been lost forever. A quick point of order, that angelic music, I didn't add it. It's from the documentary. Anyway, back to Michael.
Now, for weeks I'd been watching the watershed saturate with almost daily rainfall. And now, almost unbelievably, it was raining about 3/4 of an inch an hour across portions of our watershed. I never slept on Wednesday nights.
This was not a man given to flights of hyperbole. Victor A. Michael was born in 1934, just outside Williamsport, Pennsylvania. He grew up in Scranton and graduated from Bloomsburg University in 1957. After that, he went into radio. Even though he was the owner and manager of his stations, he often did it all, going on air, handling the odd electric jobs that needed to be done. In a photograph taken of him around the time of Agnes, with heavy, dark-rimmed glasses framing his serious face, bald on the top of his head with a strap of hair pulled across the crown, he looks a bit like a government economist. In what audio snippets I have of him during Agnes, it's clear that he sees his station's role as a direct participant in the community's preparation for the storm and its recovery from it. For the next several days, the broadcast would turn into a de facto emergency hotline. Stoll has listened to the agony of Agnes many times, and it never fails to impress him what Michael and his colleagues were able to do given the constraints imposed by the storm and the technology of the day.
I don't know. I love listening to it. There are a few mini dramas. One is actually about like radio broadcasting itself. And it's kind of about the technologies of weather and flood forecasting that were available in 1972. So one of the kind of experiences of river towns north of Harrisburg is they had to kind of be on their own in determining the flood crests in 1972. There were, there's a huge river forecasting center out of Harrisburg, and they were transmitting what they thought would be the flood crests at various towns. But the technology they were working with was crumbling in front of them because of the storm. So you had meteorologists on the air like Vic Michael and Milton saying, here's what I'm hearing from Harrisburg will be our flood crest, but I don't think that's going to be the case. I actually think it's going to be a lot higher.
In an era before cell phones and internet, people in the Milton area would have been in the dark if not for updates from Michael and his crew at WMLP. One member of that team was Paul Hartman.
We do not have a television station in our immediate area, so Milton didn't have the advantage of having a television station in our backyard.
WMLP was normally a top 40 station, but during Agnes, Hartman and his colleagues went on the air and stayed on the air, relaying information about river crest levels, missing persons, road closures, rainfall totals, sometimes even directing supplies and manpower to where they were needed most.
That family that was trapped down at the Bucknell View Trailer Court had not yet been evacuated, and they were sitting on the roof of their mobile home. The water was up to the roof of the mobile home down at the Bucknell View Mobile Home Court, and the people still had not been evacuated. And if anyone out there has a boat that they could get down there and get those people, they are on the roof.
At one point, with the floodwaters threatening the station's downtown Milton broadcast, the crew evacuated to a Spartan transmitter shack located on a hill on the opposite side of the Susquehanna River. This clip begins with Hartman narrating in the documentary.
Suddenly, the WMLP studios in downtown Milton are without electricity. The voice you hear now is John Knight, who during this time sustains the broadcast on the other side of the river at the transmitter location.
Right now, we have the emergency generator set up at our studios at the YMCA building. Due to a power failure in Milton, we've got everything back in operation now except our control board.
Hartman still lives in Lewisburg, just a couple miles downriver from Milton. And that's where our interview was, on his back porch, surrounded by Pittsburgh Pirates memorabilia.
We didn't have a record player, we didn't have records, we didn't have a news machine, we didn't have access. All we had were people calling in.
How do you fill all that time?
We didn't have any trouble filling. The calls were constant, 24 hours a day, and even in the middle of the night people called us.
After sounding the alarm about people trapped on the roof of their home, the station reported on their rescue. A helicopter came and whisked them to safety. Here's Hartman interviewing one of the exhausted survivors, just hours after it all happened.
And Mrs. Weaver, how did you get into the helicopter?
They landed on our roof.
They landed on the roof.
Yes, and the roof was cracking, and we hurried up and got in before it gave away. So I don't know if we lost the trailer, if it sank in, or what. But we don't care. Our lives are saved, and we're safe. We can always replace that, but we can't replace our lives.
You said it all.
While simultaneously reporting on and grappling with the storm, WMLP had a clash erupting on another front. As we've heard, Vic Michael relying on his own observations and expertise in hydrology, had publicly rejected the flood forecast issued by the local National Weather Service office. He was sure the Susquehanna was going to rise much higher, and he told his audience so. That drew a strong response from local authorities, Hartman recalled.
We got in all kinds of trouble. The FCC contacted us in Washington. The Milton Police Chief, the Milton Borough Council President, officials in the immediate area said, why are you guys scaring the daylights out of people, telling people that it's going to be worse than what the National Flood Forecasting Service is predicting?
Andrew Stoll again.
And then he was getting phone calls from people being like, you're scaring folk. Why are you scaring people? Why are you alarming people this way? This is really irresponsible. Turns out he was right. Milton crested at 35.1 feet, the highest, still number one in Milton. And people did not evacuate because they were trusting Harrisburg's predictions versus Vic Michael's.
But some people did heed Michael's warnings, and were glad they did.
My name is Ray Leeser. I'm 82. At the time of the flood, I was 32.
His father opened a shoe repair business in downtown Milton in 1940 and ran it until his death in 1966. Leeser and his younger brother John took over after that and decided to get into the business of selling new shoes instead of just fixing them. So that means if the store flooded, thousands of shoes and all their equipment would be ruined, and by extension, they'd be ruined. As Agnes ratcheted up the height of the Susquehanna, Ray and John followed its progress. Every hour, they checked the latest prediction at Milton's town hall, and they visited the river gauge on the outskirts of town. They weren't satisfied with what they were hearing from officials, so they paid a visit to Vic Michael in person.
We went up to the radio station, I think it was at nighttime, and we talked to Victor, and he told us, he said, boys, he said, they're laughing at me, they're ridiculing me. He said, people are making fun of me. He said, I truly believe that we're going to be a record-breaking flood. WMLP was a small AM station, but they had kept up. We had people did a good job with the news, the weather, but we had listened to the weather for years on that station and knew the majority of the time that he was right.
Mm-hmm. After conferring with another amateur forecaster who agreed with Michael's prediction, the Leeser brothers made their call. They were going to empty the store. They recruited some help and loaded 5,000 pairs of shoes into a tractor trailer as the rain continued to fall. Reminiscing about that day all these years later, Ray Leeser and his wife Dottie are still astonished by the passers-by who taunted them for packing up.
But as we were moving out, we were really ridiculed.
Yeah, people were walking by the store.
Laughing at us.
They were laughing at us, pointing. All the time we were walking out the front door carrying cartons with anywhere
These are
from...
merchants I'm talking about, not just town people. Merchants.
Yeah.
Did you have second thoughts? Like, well, maybe these people are right?
You're
shaking your head,
I don't
Dottie.
think we did.
We just, common sense told us from prior experiences with the river that it did not take much to bring the river up. I mean, it's unbelievable that where the river lays now, that we could get 7 foot of water in the store on the first floor, but it happened.
7 feet of water in their store. After the storm passed, the Leesers had a lot of work to do, tearing up the soggy carpet and shoveling out the mud. But within a week, they were back in business. And in fact, Leeser's shoe store remains in business in the same location at 18 Broadway Street. Their daughter is in charge now. If not for the right forecast, the store probably wouldn't have survived Agnes, Ray admitted.
If we weren't able to save our inventory and our repair equipment, we'd have had to go out of business because we were in debt to the bank for the equipment and in debt to shoe companies.
It wasn't covered by any insurance?
No.
How did Vic Michael know that the Weather Service forecast was going to come up short? We'll talk about that after the break.
Hi, this is Laura Lutz, editor at the Chesapeake Bay Journal. I hope you're enjoying our podcast, and I'd like to invite you to join the community of Bay Journal readers. If you care about climate change, wildlife, clean air, healthy communities, and of course the Bay and its rivers, you'll find news you can use at the Bay Journal, along with some great ideas for outdoor travel. Our subscriptions are free. Check us out at bayjournal.com and click on subscribe to start receiving the best independent environmental news in the Bay region.
Hello again. On this episode of Chesapeake Uncharted, we're wading into a 50-year-old controversy over how much the Susquehanna River would flood during the remnants of Tropical Storm Agnes. First, let's recap. The National Weather Service predicted on the morning of June 22nd that the Susquehanna would crest at about 25 feet in the Milton area at 6 o'clock that evening. If that forecast had held true, that would have been destructive, but maybe not the worst that could happen. Between the 1870s, when regular record-keeping began, and 1972, the West Branch had reached 25 feet on 5 separate occasions. The most recent was March 1964, at 28 feet. And the worst event, the one most often compared to Agnes, was the St. Patrick's Day flood of 1936, when the crest topped out at 34.07 feet. Vic Michael immediately casts doubt on the official forecast, advising his listeners that the river would still be rising at 6 p.m., and it would likely keep rising for several hours beyond that after the rain subsided. It wasn't until that evening, several hours after Michael's grim forecast, that the National Weather Service finally caught up.
The River Forecasting Service at Harrisburg then confirms the WMLP report.
A severe record-breaking flood is in progress on the Susquehanna River near Harrisburg. The forecast at Harrisburg, repeating at Harrisburg, is for 32 feet Friday morning. At Harrisburg, this is 3 feet above the maximum of record set in March of 1936.
1 hour later, at 10 p.m., the crest for Milton is predicted, and it is 1936 all over again.
The crest right now predicted by Harrisburg, this is official, 36.6 at 10 p.m. tomorrow. This is the shocking news for Milton, 36.6 at 10 p.m. tomorrow.
That forecast turned out to be pretty accurate, just overshot it by a couple of feet, but precious hours had ticked by. Hours that residents and business owners in the now broader flood zone could have used to prepare for it. In Milton and elsewhere along the Susquehanna, where an accurate forecast was late in arriving, the consequences were deadly. I spoke about this with Charles Ross, a hydrologist with the National Weather Service's Flood Program Office in State College, Pennsylvania, and he told me that if another Agnes-type storm were to happen today, there would be fewer deaths, partly because river forecasting has greatly improved.
How much would have been prevented today? I mean, I think certainly the fatality count would have been less. There has been a lot of flood protection measures that have been done, and some new flood walls and levees have been invoked, which certainly helps. There's still going to be a lot of areas that are going to be flooded when the next time we have Agnes levels, and the suffering will still be high in places. That's not going to change in places, but I think the number and the amount will be less given our abilities to forecast better, and we have better mitigation structures and the ability to get people out of harm's way.
The problem with river forecasting in 1972, Ross said, was that there was a built-in delay.
There was river forecasting, but they didn't use forecast rainfall, so they really weren't good until the rain was on the ground. That's probably the major difference. We use what's called QPF, quantitative precipitation forecasts. So this QPF is like the acronym that we use. They did not have QPF in their models back then, or if they did, it was very crude.
What was the significance of that, in Agnes?
Just not being able to get a good forecast out until a day before, until a lot of the water was on the ground. I mean, they were using generalities like we expect major flooding, but they didn't have the ability to take the forecast of rainfall and have the model give them an estimate of what was going to happen back then. Now, once it was on the ground and they had routing techniques and they could route water around the basin, their forecasts actually got pretty good. I mean, they weren't horrible, but the timing was not enough, to have for the decision making that you really need to have on a river of this size.
Maybe a day's notice at best. That's not a lot of time to get ready, especially when the rain is already falling and the water is already rising. After Agnes, the town of Milton struggled. Between 1970 and 1980, about 12% of the town's population left. Some businesses threw in the towel after the storm. When the remnants of Hurricane Eloise swept through the area in 1975, parts of downtown Milton flooded again. Not as badly, but enough that there was another exodus from town. When you drive around, as I recently did, you can still find gaps where buildings used to be near the river. Of course, there were other economic factors at play, but as Harmon sees it, Milton really hasn't been the same since 1972.
So Milton never recovered from the flood, really. They made a brave recovery and they made a stab at it, and they've certainly cleaned up the town, but it never came back the way it was.
From his knowledge of the Susquehanna watershed, Vic Michael boldly predicted that the flood would be worse than the authorities said. Those who listened got a head start preparing for the worst. Sadly, I didn't get a chance to interview Michael personally. He eventually retired from broadcasting. He stayed in central Pennsylvania for the rest of his life and died in January 2021. He was 86 years old. Next time, we'll explore Agnes with a wider lens to bring into view how communities that thought they were in the clear still ended up underwater. Yes, it rained an awful lot during Agnes, but as Andrew Stoll told me, the geology of the Susquehanna River didn't help. In many rivers around the Chesapeake Bay, the bottom is soft. When floodwater rushes in, it scours the sediment from the bottom, deepening the river. A deeper river can hold more water, meaning less spills out onto the surrounding land.
In the Susquehanna, that cannot happen because the substrate is hard rock. That's a geological tale that goes back millions of years of how the river was formed. So when the water rains and comes from the Susquehanna River basin and enters the main stem, it goes up. It can only go up. It cannot penetrate the hard rock substrate. And that makes it a very flood-prone area.
So some things have changed over the past 50 years in central Pennsylvania. In some areas, there are new flood fighting measures in the ground, such as flood walls and water collecting ponds. Also, forecasting has taken great leaps forward. Warnings can reach people sooner, if they're willing to listen, of course. But the fact remains that the Susquehanna is a relatively shallow, hard-bottom river. And, as we discussed last season, climate change is fueling more cloudbursts, making rains like Agnes all the likelier in the future. We'll talk more about that later this season, but for now, know this. It has happened before, and in some ways, it's even easier for it to happen again.
This is a climate hazard that we're seeing in our state. It doesn't look like a wildfire, it doesn't look like a drowning island, but this is what climate change looks like, and we need to start preparing now to help these property owners, help these landowners, help our neighbors adjust to that.
Greenfin Studio combines creative design, strategic marketing, and scientific expertise to deliver for our clients. Visit greenfinstudio.com to view their portfolio and ask them how they can help you. Chesapeake Uncharted is brought to you by the Bay Journal, your source for independent environmental news in the Chesapeake region. Production for this episode was by me, Jeremy Cox. The story was edited by Laura Lutz. Our marketing and advertising director is Jackie Kane. You can find more episodes of Chesapeake Uncharted on your favorite streaming service or at ChesapeakeUncharted.com. If you like what you're hearing, sign up for a free Bay Journal news subscription at BayJournal.com. Until next time, this has been Jeremy Cox. Take care.